In 1945, George Patton made a prediction that everyone called insane. He said the Soviet Union would become America's greatest enemy. He said Eastern Europe would disappear behind an iron curtain. He said the next war would be fought over Berlin. They called him crazy. They removed him from command. 45 years later, when the Berlin Wall fell, historians opened Patton's classified files and found something chilling. He had been right about everything. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the Allied world, soldiers embraced. Civilians danced in the streets, and champagne flowed freely. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The most devastating war in human history was finally over in Europe. In London, Winston Churchill addressed cheering crowds. In New York, ticker tape rained down on celebrating masses. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin raised a toast to victory. But in a headquarters building in Bavaria, Germany, one American general was not celebrating. General George S. Patton stood alone in his office, staring at a large map spread across his desk. His eyes were not on the defeated German positions marked in black. They were fixed on the red arrows indicating Soviet forces that now occupied half of Europe. While the world celebrated the end of one war, Patton was already thinking about the next one. Patton had seen the Soviets up close during the final weeks of the war. When American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River in April 1945, there had been handshakes and photographs for the newspapers. But Patton noticed things that others chose to ignore. He observed how Soviet officers treated their own soldiers with brutal indifference to human life. He watched how they stripped occupied territories of anything valuable, loading trains with German machinery, art, and wealth. He listened to reports of Soviet soldiers committing atrocities against civilian populations, and he noticed how Soviet commanders looked at American equipment, American supplies, American positions, not with the eyes of allies, but with the calculating gaze of future enemies. Patton had spent his life studying war. He knew what an enemy looked like, and he was convinced that the Soviet Union was not a friend temporarily wearing an ally's uniform. It was the next great threat to Western civilization. In the weeks following Victory in Europe Day, Patton began speaking openly about his concerns. At first, he shared his thoughts only with close staff members. The Soviets cannot be trusted, he told them. They have taken Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. They will not give these countries back. They will install puppet governments and create a communist empire stretching from Berlin to the Pacific. His staff listened nervously. These were not popular opinions. The Soviet Union was officially an ally. President Roosevelt had personally negotiated with Stalin at Yalta. Criticizing the Soviets was not just unpopular, it was potentially career-ending. But Patton had never cared about his career more than he cared about speaking what he believed to be the truth. And the truth, as Patton saw it, was terrifying. The Western Allies had just helped one totalitarian regime defeat another, only to hand half of Europe to a third. By June 1945, Patton was no longer keeping his opinions to staff meetings. He began sharing them with anyone who would listen, including journalists. In one widely reported comment, Patton compared the Soviet political system to the Nazi regime the Allies had just defeated. The statement caused immediate controversy. Washington was furious. The war against Japan was still ongoing, and American leadership desperately wanted to maintain good relations with Stalin, hoping for Soviet assistance in the Pacific theater. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now the supreme Allied commander in Europe, received urgent messages from Washington demanding that Patton be silenced. Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower respected Patton as a battlefield commander, perhaps the finest America had ever produced. But Patton's political instincts were disastrous. Eisenhower tried to explain the delicate diplomatic situation. Patton listened, nodded, and continued saying exactly what he believed. What most people did not know was that Patton's concerns went far beyond public statements. In private communications that remained classified for decades, Patton outlined specific military scenarios for confronting the Soviet Union. He argued that American forces in Europe were at their peak strength, while Soviet forces, though numerically superior, were exhausted and overextended. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles back to Russia. Their equipment, while effective, was inferior to American technology in many categories. Most importantly, the United States possessed air superiority, and as of July 1945, the atomic bomb. Patton believed there was a narrow window of opportunity. Within 2 or 3 years, the Soviets would consolidate their hold on Eastern Europe, rebuild their industrial capacity, and develop their own atomic weapons. After that, any confrontation would be catastrophic. The time to act, if action was necessary, was now. Patton even proposed what many considered unthinkable: rearming German soldiers to fight alongside American forces against the Soviets. The idea was shocking. Germany had just been defeated after 6 years of brutal warfare. Millions had died fighting against the Nazi regime. And now Patton was suggesting that German soldiers should be given their weapons back and pointed east. But Patton saw military reality, not political sentiment. German soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and highly motivated to fight communists. After all, they had been doing exactly that for 4 years on the Eastern Front. German generals understood Soviet tactics better than any American commander. German infrastructure, though damaged, could support military operations. Patton was not suggesting forgiveness for Nazi crimes. He was making a cold military calculation. The enemy of my enemy can be a useful ally. Washington rejected the idea completely. The political impossibility of rearming Germans mere weeks after their surrender was obvious to everyone except Patton. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, Patton's behavior became increasingly problematic for American leadership. He was now military governor of Bavaria, responsible for overseeing the denazification process, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of power. But Patton approached denazification with obvious reluctance. He needed experienced administrators to run the occupied territory, and many of the most competent administrators had been Nazi Party members. Patton argued that most party members had joined for career advancement, not ideological conviction. Removing all of them would leave Bavaria ungovernable. He compared Nazi Party membership to membership in American political parties, a practical affiliation rather than a deep commitment. The comparison was tone-deaf at best, offensive at worst. When journalists reported Patton's comments, the reaction was immediate and furious. Holocaust survivors were still being liberated from camps. The full horror of Nazi crimes was only beginning to be understood, and here was an American general appearing to minimize Nazi Party membership. Eisenhower was now facing enormous pressure to remove Patton from command. Politicians in Washington demanded action. Jewish organizations protested. Allied governments expressed concern. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters on September 28, 1945. The meeting was painful for both men. Eisenhower had protected Patton before after the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily in 1943, when Patton struck hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice. Eisenhower had kept Patton in command despite calls for his dismissal because he knew Patton's value on the battlefield. But the battlefield was now quiet. There were no more enemies to fight, at least not enemies that Washington acknowledged. Patton's value as a combat commander was no longer relevant. His liability as a political figure was. Eisenhower told Patton that he was being relieved of command of the Third Army, the unit Patton had led across France, through the Battle of the Bulge and into the heart of Germany. It was, for Patton, like losing a part of himself. On October 7, 1945, Patton officially handed over command of the Third Army. He was reassigned to lead the 15th Army, a paper unit responsible for compiling the official history of the war in Europe. It was a meaningless assignment, designed to keep Patton busy and out of trouble until he could be quietly retired. Patton understood exactly what was happening. He was being shelved, removed from any position of real authority, punished for speaking truths that no one wanted to hear. In letters to his wife, Beatrice, Patton expressed his frustration and bitterness. He wrote about the blindness of political leaders who could not see the Soviet threat. He predicted that within 5 years the United States would be in a Cold War with Russia. He suggested that his removal was not just about his comments, but about silencing a voice that powerful people found inconvenient. December 9, 1945. A gray, cold morning near Mannheim, Germany, Patton was being driven to a pheasant hunting trip, one of the few pleasures left to him in his diminished role. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, sat beside him in the back of a 1939 Cadillac staff car. The roads were relatively empty. The war had been over for 7 months, and occupied Germany was slowly returning to something resembling normal life. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, as Patton's car approached a railway crossing, a 2.5-ton army truck suddenly turned left, directly into the path of the Cadillac. The collision was not particularly violent. Neither General Gay nor the driver was seriously injured, but Patton, who had been looking out the window at the moment of impact, was thrown forward. His head struck the partition separating the front and back seats. He slumped into Gay's arms, unable to move. Patton was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg. The diagnosis was devastating: a cervical spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. Doctors operated to stabilize his spine, but the damage was permanent. The general who had led armored charges across Europe, who had stood in open vehicles under enemy fire, who had seemed almost supernaturally immune to death on countless battlefields, was now confined to a hospital bed, unable to move his arms or legs. His wife, Beatrice, flew from America to be at his side. Old comrades came to pay their respects. Eisenhower sent messages of support, but Patton knew the truth. He would never command troops again. He would never ride in a tank again. He would never walk again. For a man who had lived for action, for movement, for war, it was a fate worse than death. During his 12 days in the hospital, Patton received many visitors. To almost all of them, he said variations of the same thing. He talked about the Soviets. He talked about the coming conflict that everyone refused to see. He talked about the opportunities that had been lost, the decisions that had been wrong, the warnings that had been ignored. "They will regret not listening to me about the Russians," he told one visitor. "Mark my words, within 10 years, everything I predicted will come true, and they will remember that they called me crazy." Some visitors found his persistence admirable. A dying man still fighting for what he believed. Others found it sad. A great warrior unable to let go of battles he could never fight. But Patton had always been stubborn. Death was not going to change that. On December 21, 1945, at 5:50 in the afternoon, General George Sigis Patton died in his sleep. The official cause was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, complications of his paralysis. He was 60 years old. His body was not returned to the United States, following military custom for soldiers who died in Europe, and honoring what was said to be his own wish to be buried with his men. Patton was interred at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside thousands of Third Army soldiers who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. The warrior who had led them in life would rest among them in death. The funeral was attended by generals, diplomats, and ordinary soldiers who had served under Patton. Many wept openly. Whatever his flaws, whatever his controversies, Patton had been a leader who inspired fierce loyalty. They were not just burying a general. They were burying an era. Almost immediately after Patton's death, questions arose about the circumstances of his accident. The driver of the truck that struck Patton's car was a young technical sergeant, whose identity would later become part of the mystery. He claimed that he had signaled his turn, that the collision was unavoidable. But witnesses offered conflicting accounts. The investigation into the accident was remarkably brief and superficial. Key evidence was not collected. Witnesses were not thoroughly interviewed. The truck that struck Patton's car disappeared and was never examined. The driver faced no charges and was quickly transferred out of Europe. For decades, historians and investigators have wondered, was Patton's accident really an accident? His open hostility to the Soviet Union had made him enemies in Moscow. His willingness to speak uncomfortable truths had made him enemies in Washington. His proposals to confront Soviet expansion had threatened powerful interests on both sides. No definitive evidence of foul play has ever been proven, but the questions have never fully been answered either. In 1979, a former military intelligence operative came forward with a stunning claim. He alleged that he had been ordered to arrange Patton's death, and that the accident was actually a staged assassination. His claims were never independently verified, and many historians dismiss them as fabrication or delusion. But the timing of Patton's death was undeniably convenient for those who wanted him silenced. Alive, Patton would have continued speaking. He would have written memoirs, given interviews, testified before Congress. He would have been a persistent, powerful voice, arguing that the United States had betrayed Eastern Europe to Soviet domination. Dead, he became a historical figure whose warnings could be safely filed away and forgotten, at least for a while. The years immediately following Patton's death seemed to prove his critics right. The Soviet Union remained officially an ally. The United Nations was established with Soviet participation. Hope remained that the wartime alliance could evolve into a lasting peace, but then piece by piece, Patton's predictions began coming true. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his famous speech at Westminster College in Missouri, warning that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, almost the exact phrase Patton had used in private conversations months earlier. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine committed the United States to containing Soviet expansion. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded Berlin, and American planes had to airlift supplies to prevent the city from starving. The Cold War that Patton had predicted was no longer a prediction. It was reality. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, some began to remember Patton's warnings differently. What had seemed like the ravings of a warmonger now looked more like prophetic insight. Patton had said the Soviets would install puppet governments throughout Eastern Europe. They did. Patton had said the Soviets would try to push the Western Allies out of Berlin. They tried. Patton had said that American soldiers would one day face Soviet-backed forces in combat. In June 1950, American troops were fighting in Korea against an army equipped and supported by the Soviet Union. Everything Patton had predicted was happening, and the man who had predicted it was buried in a cemetery in Luxembourg, silenced forever. His old comrades, the ones who had thought him extreme, began to wonder if perhaps George had seen something the rest of them had missed. The Cold War lasted 45 years. It consumed trillions of dollars in military spending. It brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. It spawned proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other countries. It divided families, destroyed nations, and held entire populations hostage behind walls and barbed wire. And it unfolded almost exactly as Patton had said it would. When the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, historians began re-examining the decisions made in 1945. Had there been a moment when a different choice could have changed history? Had Patton been right that a brief, decisive confrontation in 1945 could have prevented 5 decades of Cold War? The questions are impossible to answer definitively, but they are no longer dismissed as crazy. Today, Patton's grave in Luxembourg remains one of the most visited sites in the American cemetery. Visitors come from around the world to pay respects to the general who predicted the Cold War. His headstone is simple, identical to those of the soldiers buried around him, just as he requested. There is no special monument, no elaborate memorial, just a white cross among thousands of white crosses, a general resting among his men. But his legacy is larger than any monument could capture. Patton was wrong about many things during his life. He was crude, offensive, politically ignorant, and often his own worst enemy. But about the Soviet Union, about the coming struggle between East and West, about the shape of the world for the next half-century, he was right. And being right about the biggest question of his era is perhaps the only legacy a general truly needs. In his final days, paralyzed and dying in a hospital bed, Patton reportedly said, "It is a hell of a way to die." He had always imagined falling in battle, leading a charge, going out in a blaze of glory. Instead, he died from a traffic accident, slowly, in a hospital room, surrounded by doctors instead of soldiers. But perhaps there is a different way to see his ending. Patton's last battle was not fought with tanks and artillery. It was fought with words and ideas. He fought to warn the world about a threat that almost everyone refused to acknowledge. He lost that battle in his lifetime. He was silenced, removed, and ultimately killed, whether by accident or design. But ideas are harder to kill than men, and Patton's ideas, his warnings, his predictions, outlived him by decades. The general who saw the future died before that future arrived, but he had already won his final battle. History proved George Patton right. Patton saw what was coming when everyone else was celebrating. He warned them about the Soviets, and they called him crazy. 45 years later, the Berlin Wall fell, exactly as he predicted. So here is the question that haunts historians to this day. If they had listened to Patton in 1945, could the Cold War have been avoided, or would it have started World War III? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe Patton deserved better, share this story. The general who saw the future should not be forgotten.